All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour à tous. My name is Christian Numi. I'm a research and evaluation associate at the Future Skills Center. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on the road to net zero global lessons from place-based skills development. This session is part of our ongoing effort to work in ways to explore how place-based community-led skills strategies can support a fair transition to a net zero economy by helping workers and regions to adapt without leaving the communities they call home. Today's gathering is a precursor to the upcoming report on this issue by the Future Skills Center and the Institute for Research and Public Policy. I'll go first through land acknowledgement, um, then a few words about the agenda today, and some housekeeping, and I'll introduce our speakers and panelists. Okay. Given that FSC is hosting this event, the land acknowledgement is specific to Toronto. However, I encourage you all to reflect and acknowledge the specific land you are currently located in. The Future Skills Center acknowledges that Toronto is situated upon traditional and current Indigenous territories that include the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit. The treaties that cover these territories include the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes, and the Upper Canada treaties. So this session has about two big components. The first will be a presentation shortly, and then later on we'll have a panel, and we'll have opportunity for a few questions towards the end. So some housekeeping notes here. This webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be shared with other registered attendees in the next few days. Throughout the sessions, we encourage you to interact with us using the Q&A option in the Zoom screen panel. Feel free to engage in English and French. Et comme toujours, nous souhaitons une bienvenue particulière à nos participants francophones. Simultaneous interpretation services in English and French are available at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It's by default set in English, but you can switch to French if you prefer. Before introducing our speakers and panelists, I would like to hope that you can also join us a little bit later at 2:15 for a peer learning group to go a little bit deeper on what we are going to talk about today. Typically, these peer learning groups provide participants with the opportunity to discuss common interests, challenges, and resources. And the goal really is to facilitate an open discussion among participants in a somewhat informal and safe shared space. So let me introduce you to the speakers. Shortly, Shaima Yassin, Senior Research Director, and Abigail Jackson, Research Associate. They both are from the Institute for Research and Public Policy. Shaima and Abigail will have their presentation in a moment. Then Alex Stephens, our FSC's Director of Programs, will moderate the panel discussion that will feature Jim Stanford, Economist and Director of the Center for Future Work, Jennifer Robson, Associate Professor, Political Management at Carleton, and Shaima Yassin will join them as well. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to Shaima and Abigail for their presentation. The floor is yours. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Christian. So welcome everyone to our webinar. And perhaps I'll just start by a very small introduction to the Institute for Research and Public Policy, the IRPP. And for those of you who aren't familiar with our work, we're a national independent think tank. We're based in Montreal, and we work to connect the worlds of academic and rigorous research and public policy. On est une organisation bilingue, donc du coup, vous pouvez accéder à toutes nos recherches dans les deux langues officielles. Personally, this has been one of my pet projects throughout 2025. And together with my colleague Abigail Jackson, we're very pleased that the IRPP was able to lead the research for this project in collaboration with the Future Skills Center. We particularly want to kick off our presentation by thanking the FSC team, especially Alex, who worked with us early on to shape the scope and the kickoff of the project, and of course, all the rest of the FSC and the IRPP teams that helped make the publication and the release of the full package possible. And also, while I have the floor, I wish to send my special thanks to our contributors to the case studies, especially our IRPP and I believe FSC's two friends, Jim Stanford and Jen Robson, who led the research of the three of the 8 case studies we have here. Now, I wish to share with you at the beginning of our presentation what I found really interesting about this project is that it let us look outward to the international experiences with place-based skills and workforce development, and in particular in the context of economic transformations that are driven by the net zero. And really, those sort of reviews, they give us the chance to learn from both what worked and what did not work in those models. So Canada can adapt and apply those lessons instead of losing efforts in reinventing the wheel every time we try to come up with a policy or a policy change. Now, what's worth noting is that while the package was initially centered on the net zero, really the framework is extendable to other kinds of shocks, disruptions, and transformations. For example, in our work at the IRPP, we've looked at changes in trade policies such as the recent US tariffs, for instance, and we've already referenced this work in several instances in that context. So with that, I will hand things over to my colleague, Abigail Jackson, whom I would like particularly to acknowledge and thank for co-leading this work with me, often under quite tight timelines. I know Abigail must be giggling there on her end, if not showing on the screen, but surely at the back of her head. But anyhow, Abigail will walk you through an overview of our research and our main findings. Over to you, Abigail.
Thanks, Shaima. Yeah, it's great to be here today. And to situate our presentation in today's discussion, I'll start by first defining what we mean when we say place-based. So our working definition identifies policies that explicitly target the needs and opportunities of a specific community, city, or region. And unlike one-size-fits-all programs, place-based policies are really tailored to local assets and challenges, and they're often co-designed or co-led with community members. So we at the IRPP conducted an international review with this lens in mind, and we pursued the following 8 case studies you can see here on the map. Now, each one has its own variations in design and stakeholder engagement, geography, and specific objectives. But when we view them collectively, these 8 cases really come together to offer complementary pieces of a puzzle that, when we assemble them, can inform a comprehensive, unique to Canada framework for building workforce resilience in the net zero transition. Now, as a quick overview of our methodology of how we arrived at these case studies, we initially began by compiling a broad list of initiatives, and then we evaluated each one against 11 criteria that were designed to capture both breadth and depth. And we focused on OECD countries as well here, given the availability of data, as well as also potential comparability with the Canadian context. And as you can see, our screening criteria include a wide range of topics, including the initiative's explicit or implicit links to the net zero transition, the place-based elements in the design or implementation, and that could be either broadly defined, so targeting a region or sector-specific outcomes, or more narrowly defined, so having deeply embedded processes involving local governance with strong community engagement really at its core. But we also looked at the type of intervention, the evidence of innovative practices, alignment with Canadian workforce needs, as well as the availability of measurable outcomes. We also paid particular attention to initiatives that address key workforce challenges that are identified in this typology that you can see here, which we developed based on a review of literature on the topic. So, in addition to our screening criteria, we sought to assemble a compendium of cases that would shine a light on different aspects of the net zero transition, as well as these various challenges. Knowing that the structural economic changes associated with global decarbonization are quite complex and they can vary significantly from place to place. Now, one might typically think about displacement and mismatches when it comes to common challenges, but the delivery bottlenecks and the income and inclusion dimensions are as important. So once we had our 8 case studies, we conducted a comparative analysis. So when we looked at the common drivers and enablers and those contextual factors that really facilitated the initiatives, we saw that the presence of established decarbonization goals and climate commitments really enabled the interventions or served as the impetus in many cases. While in other cases, policymakers were more driven by a desire to mitigate the socioeconomic impacts of disruption or to support distressed or vulnerable regions. In many cases, the policies and interventions were facilitated by the presence of government strategies, legislation, and dedicated bodies that often provide an overarching framework for the place-based actions that follow. And we see that policymakers across the cases often recognize that the impacts of economic transitions are highly localized. And so they often sought community participation and engagement across a wide range of stakeholders, which consistently enabled them to tailor their interventions to local needs and leverage local assets. We also see some common policy strategies that emerge out of these contexts. So we see that it's common across the cases for upskilling, training, and certification to be provided directly at the local level to help local workers transition into new jobs and to stay in their communities. Another common strategy that emerged is promoting economic diversification to really support those transitioning communities. So in some cases, this is done by exploring and expanding new local industries, but in other cases, it's done through more targeted investment incentives and industrial policy interventions. We found that employment supports like career counseling, job banks, reemployment services, and local job placements were also commonly deployed to help impacted workers find new jobs locally. And in several cases, the initiatives layered on additional support for vulnerable groups who would otherwise face barriers to participation. In some cases, there were also targeted measures to protect workers' income stability through the transition or to offset the costs of training. Now, despite there being considerable commonalities across the case studies, there's also notable variations in how the interventions are delivered and governed. So on the delivery side, we see that some of the initiatives are delivered nationally, while others are delivered more at the regional or local level. And on the governance side, we see a spectrum whereby some of the initiatives are more centralized, which tends to correlate with more of a national program like what we see with France's personal training accounts, whereas others are much more decentralized or community-led and governed. So you can take the UK case, for example, in which that county-level government is really driving the initiative. Some cases also fall in the middle or take more of a mixed approach. So you can take Spain, for example, which uses a multi-level system whereby a national ministry provides high-level guidance while agreements take place at the regional level, and the funds and projects are actually managed at the local level. So through this research, what we found is that place-based approaches to workforce development are highly relevant to Canada's current situation, due in part to the regional concentration of sectors that are susceptible to workforce disruption in Canada, including those that are exposed to challenges associated with the net zero transition, as well as trade disruptions. So to inform a unique to Canada approach, we've compiled these 10 lessons you can see here from across the cases that we think are particularly salient. Our research shows that consensus building and tripartite collaboration between government, industry, and labor unions can enable more coordinated transition efforts, and that community involvement in transition planning builds essential local buy-in and resilience. We also see that developing local viable replacement industries before phasing out existing ones can proactively help to prevent community-level economic disruption, while leveraging transferable skills across those transitioning industries can help to smooth those worker transitions, while robust targeted social supports can mitigate risks for workers, particularly those who face higher barriers to participation. We also know that participation of Indigenous peoples and communities in transition planning and implementation is essential throughout the entire process. The cases also show that rural communities in particular may require additional targeted support to stabilize their populations, which should be taken into account when designing interventions. And having mechanisms in place for continuous assessment and plan adaptation are also important for keeping strategies responsive, especially in a context in which we know that things can change rapidly. And another big one is that harmonizing workforce training with broader economic development plans can make initiatives more effective than if they are done in their own respective silos. And finally, technical, financial, and administrative support is often necessary to help communities with capacity constraints, particularly smaller, more remote ones, implement their transition plans. So based on this research from this project, as well as the IRPP's ongoing research related to our Community Transformations project, we categorize these lessons into 4 mutually reinforcing policy pillars. We have strategic, community-led economic development, proactive, coordinated skills development, responsive, community-wide social supports, and targeted, empowering place-based industrial policy, all of which must be supported by data, evaluation, and continuous learning. When taken together, these lessons from our international case studies offer concrete steps that policymakers in Canada can take to build a continuum of workforce supports, from rapid response to long-term renewal, that is practical, place-based, and community-led. So thank you very much for your time. That wraps my part of this presentation. We have a resource slide here, and as I understand it, the slides will be shared after the presentation. And I'll pass it back over to Alex, who will introduce the panel. And I hope you've got your questions ready, because it's going to be a good discussion.
Okay, thank you, Abigail, for a very good job at giving a very succinct presentation overview of what is really quite a rich document in the report, and as well as the case studies. We have some of the authors of the case studies with us. Aside from Abigail, we've got Shaima Yessen, Jennifer Robson, and Jim Stanford, of course, who Christian presented at the beginning of our session. Oh, there we are, all of us, and we wanted to pick up on some of the themes and actually get a little bit into the case studies. I should say I've read most of the case studies. Still, maybe each case study, which is a different country, has a wealth of information. They're not short little case studies. They get into details about the different programs. They talk about the policy implications, the policy framework that supports those programs. So I really would encourage people not only to read the main report, but to delve into into the case studies, which have really quite a wealth of information. We're going to start off with a few questions that have been prepared already in advance, and from there I will follow up with some questions as the moderator. But as people come up with questions, we encourage you to join in by hitting that Q&A button and putting your question up on the dialogue. I'll ask either our panelists to answer them, or some people online will be answering, some of our colleagues at IRPP and Future Skills Center. So, so each of the three of you have done one or more of the case studies in there. You were the primary authors on these and did all the research and everything. I'm going to start with you, Jennifer, and I wanted to sort of ask. Sorry, I can't find my questions here. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So
ask me anything.
Yeah, I was about to, but maybe I'll keep it on topic. In research and policymaking, we hear a lot about the important role of coordination among different actors, whether that's between communities and governments, or industry and workers, and everything in between. Certainly in any discussions we're having nowadays about workforce planning and skills development, we inevitably come to this question of what kind of alignment and coordination of actors is needed. And I wonder if you could maybe talk about that a little bit from the case studies that you did. I think there's specifically the Michigan case study was particularly interesting, but feel free to draw on any of the others.
Yeah, well, actually, maybe I will just sort of for today's conversation zero in on the Michigan case study, and just a shout out to my co-author Julia Bruno, who was terrific to work with on this, as well as especially the team at IRPP. Okay, so the Michigan case study looks at what they call an Office for Community and Worker Economic Transition, which is inside their Department of Labor. And the Department of Labor is sort of the state level body that delivers what we're used to thinking about here in Canada as essentially EI. But down there, sort of their training side of stuff, our EI Part 2, is broken out and is available to people who are not just unemployed, but also underemployed. And then they've got this other, the sort of the income support piece. But this Office for Community and Worker Economic Transition was created by the state specifically to try and bring greater coordination at the state level so that some of those Biden era tax credits could be drawn into the state, right? There was an expectation at one point that they were hoping to attract somewhere in the neighborhood of $5.3 billion in new federal funding from what was at the time the Inflation Reduction Act, and of course all the infrastructure funding as well. I think we all know how that story ends in terms of the availability of those federal funds. And so it's meant that the office has had to pivot a little bit. But I think, sort of lesson one is for national order governments to remember that actually communities and even regions might need some coordination to access those national programs, right? And I think we heard that in Abigail's remarks about the importance of capacity building. The other thing I think that's interesting for us in Canada is when you look at how Michigan Works, which is sort of a sister organization within that Department of Labor, how they deliver their support for on-the-job training, entrepreneurial training. They have a system of like vouchers and whatnot, and they are a network of 16 offices across the state. And they have a deep devolution, right? So it's like, it's not just setting priorities at the state level, it is the individual offices that are setting, like local offices that are getting to determine their priority target populations and figure out, how are they going to do that proactive outreach. So I think, that's a really interesting model in terms of very deep devolution of authorities around there. That issue, right, of being more proactive too. I think that's something here in Canada that we're only just starting to do. Anyway, lots more to say on that, but those are some of the key ones that pop out at me.
Yeah, I mean, I maybe just very quick 30 seconds. We did ask you, all our panelists, to spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes max on your initial answers. But I did want to sort of ask you what, maybe very quickly, what elements might be missing in Canada that you saw in Michigan, for example, or what is in Canada that resembles, or what's in Canada that's better in terms of infrastructure and supports to facilitate this kind of work?
Okay, well, look, number one, I would say more stable federal policy direction that's definitely a Canadian asset that we have, and grateful for it. One thing that I wanted to come back to was that issue of Michigan's model of being more proactive. So, they've identified these key communities in transition, and they basically say if there are 50 jobs or more that are expected to be lost in these particular kinds of sectors as a result of the net zero transition between now and 2040, we're going to be more proactive, right, in terms of our approach and intervention. And they're also better at being more responsive in terms of if they know that a major wave of layoffs is happening, they kind of mobilize all of those different parts, like the Community Worker Transition Office, Michigan Works, and so forth, and kind of do these wraparound services. And I think that that's something in Canada that we're only just starting to do, and would probably be a great idea. And then, this part isn't actually in the brief because, gosh, when we were working on this a couple of months ago, it seems like a whole other lifetime in terms of public policy. It's moving so fast these days. But since a lot of those Biden era programs are no longer available, the office has really had to pivot and think about what can they do with state level resources. So it's kind of interesting. They've now spent some time doing regional consultations with communities. They've put together what they call a community transition playbook, which is really about building capacity at the local level. And now they've got funding to do a pilot initiative with 10 different communities that is all going to be about how can we leverage data assets, but also provide uh, basically like coaching and consultants to help communities develop their own plans. So, communities often have assets in their backyards that can help with the transition. Like they have strengths, they have local training providers, but sometimes they need external help to be able to have the data on that and actually to come up with a plan, right? And how are we going to diversify the local economy?
Yeah. Okay, so thanks for that follow-up. I mean, maybe we can get more into this question about of assets later on in our discussion. And I do take note that some of these approaches and on working with workforce planning and planning against layoffs and that kind of thing are only just starting in Canada. I will put a plug in for a project we were doing, in fact, where we're experimenting with exactly that with the Canadian Skills Training and Employment Coalition in the automotive sector. So speaking of automotive, I'm going to turn it to Jim. Not that your case study was on automotive, but you have a bit of a history with the automotive
I do
sector.
have a car, Alex, so it's
And you
perfectly
have a car.
fine to
That's good.
refer
That's
to me
great.
for the
Okay.
automotive sector. Sure.
All right. So vehicle owner Jim Stanford is going to I'm going to shoot the next question to you. And you were working on the Australia case study, which maybe you can tell us a little bit about, but it highlighted the importance of alignment in terms of skills and workforce development with sort of broader base, place-based industrial planning. And I wonder if you can talk about why the alignment is so important and maybe where Canada stands in relation to Australia and other jurisdictions where this kind of linkage exists. Also, sort of the same question I asked Jen as well at the end there about how do we compare with Canada, or how do Canada compare with these countries? Sorry, go
Well,
ahead.
Canada and Australia are kind of designed to be a never-ending compare and contrast exercise, aren't they, for two countries? I mean, their similarities are so obvious, the big geography, the colonial history, the resource dependence,
Yeah.
etc. But the more you dig into it, the more you see that there's important differences or nuances as well as those similarities. And this case study of a new program that really is just getting going in Australia, I think, is a good example of some of those nuances and how they can make quite a difference. So the program that I looked at is called the Net Zero Economy Authority, NZEA, which was implemented starting in 2024, late 2024 in Australia, and is just kind of working through its first applications. And it is a naturally place-based policy. It fits very well with the theme of this overall research from the IRPP. What happens is it's tailored right now to apply to instances where a coal-fired electricity generation plant is decommissioned or stops producing. And the program is aimed at managing the transition for the power plant itself, as well as any kind of associated coal mining that feeds the power plant. In many cases, there's almost like a dedicated mine that exists solely to provide coal to the power plant. So the closure of the plant obviously means the closure of the mine as well. So the whole program is tailored at these, but they're very explicit that this is in a way a test to show that this whole approach could apply for other transition related employment events. And what happens, I think the key word in this program is the authority, Net Zero Economy Authority. And they actually do give it authority to, first of all, define a transition event when it's occurring, in this case, caused by the closure of a coal plant, but also to define a region around which the implications of that transition are going to be felt. And then the authority has the power to go and consult with employers, not just the employers shedding workers because of that coal closure, but also employers in the region that are also potentially hiring as a result of the transition towards other more sustainable activities. And I think it's a very innovative way to, in a way, try and connect the dots. You know, we've all been saying
Yep.
carbon transitions are going to be important, but there's positive things happening at the same time as displacements. And how do we connect them? And the Australian model, I think, is a very ambitious. I think it will be globally significant in that it allows the authority to make those connections, including with workplaces that are hiring. And then another, I think, nuance that reflects Australia's differences from Canada is, first of all, the federal government has got more authority to do this kind of thing than is the case in Canada. They work with the state governments, but they've got the spending power and the regulatory authority to just do it. Secondly, they've got a very interesting labor relations regime there that has a very active and flexible, basically, labor tribunal. It's called the Fair Work Commission. And it has got the ability to do more than what we expect from a labor board in Canada, including, in this case, to set orders for workplaces, even if there's no union or union contract in place, set orders about some of the criteria and standards around a transition event, such as providing advance notice, affirmative action, or preferential hiring for displaced workers from a coal facility to go into one of the new places that's being built, or hiring, and other measures that mean they're not just kind of leaving it to the labor market to figure this out. They're actually getting in there with that authority, the planning authority, to try and make it happen deliberately. And it's naturally place-based. This is how it's a very interesting experiment for this project.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Again, we'll come back to some of those themes and in our Q&A there. For sure, the differences in sort of jurisdictions over education and labor market planning and that kind of thing do play into questions about how you would adapt this kind of approach to Canada, but certainly there are answers to that, and maybe hopefully we can get into some of that as well and a bit further, explore that further. I'm going to turn to I think Shaima is the one who's taking this question, if I'm not mistaken. If not, let me know whether it's both of you are taking this or if it's just Shaima. So more generally across the 8 global cases, we wanted to know what surprised you the most about how other countries are managing workforce transitions. That's the sort of first question. The second part of the question is that one of the key messages from the report highlights the importance of social supports and place-based approaches, which are especially significant for underserved groups. So I think wondering if you could talk a little bit about how these different approaches you looked at took into account the specific needs and position and context in which some of these underserved or underrepresented groups find themselves. Because we know, of course, that whenever there are these big transitions, the more abrupt and they are, there are certainly winners and certainly people who get the short end of the stick on this, and they tend to be members of particular groups. So it is we do appreciate that was highlighted in these case studies. So over to Shaima, I think, right?
Yes, thank you, Alex. So I'm not going to act surprised, since you had shared with our audience that you already shared with us a couple of those questions. But I'll share some of the surprises. But I'll share some of the surprises that we had while we were doing the research on those case studies. And so several things did stand out, and I think Abigail already shared the 10 lessons that we distilled from those case studies. But if I had to highlight just a couple, and actually Jen had touched upon some of them, I guess the first would be how deliberate, proactive, and long-term the planning is in many of those places. And the second would be how consistently they tended to focus on people and place. And people and place were really at the very heart of the decision-making process, where I would say workers were viewed more of members of families, bigger communities, rather than just units in a labor market model, right? So, and to unpack that a little bit and maybe share some specifics from different case studies. So in places like Taranaki in New Zealand, for instance, there was a national decision to phase out the offshore and oil gas, and that prompted the establishment of a roadmap and an action plan. And to be more specific, it's a 2050 roadmap and an action plan. So and that all was established in collaboration with local community partners. They covered not only jobs and skills, but also the social aspects of things. They covered health, they covered culture, the local economy. And they're also in the process of diversifying into sectors like food and fiber, like tourism, while oil and gas is still operating. So it's really that level of advanced long-term planning and thinking.
Sure.
It's not something, as Jen mentioned, it's not something that we quite see yet or systematically in Canada. Also, we were struck by how many of these initiatives were explicitly co-governed with local partners. And I think that's the essence of the place-based term, right? So there was the Spain case study, for instance, where they had a just transition strategy. They used national resources, but the real work, it happens through locally negotiated just transition agreements, where unions, employers, municipalities, and the national or the federal, in our case, could be the Just Transition Institute, would sit down together to design from the beginning the packages that would include the training, the job banks, the investment incentives that are tailored to each locality or region. I found a very interesting case study, which was Denmark. And that was in Esbjerg in Denmark. It's called the Offshore Academy as an initiative. And basically, it was the transition of workers from offshore oil and gas to offshore wind. And it's really focused on the skills congruencies between those two sectors. And it provided a very good example of using the local comparative advantage instead of just assuming that workers will just uproot to find new jobs in a way or another. And if we're talking about parallels from Canada, for the major, you could think about major offshore wind proposals like Nova Scotia's Wind West project, for instance, where we could be designing similar place-based skills training and workforce development and social supports alongside the project from the outset, rather than bolting them on after. And finally, to answer your question about the social supports, it's the degree to which social supports and equity were built into the design of those initiatives in general. So you have Denmark, for instance, they leaned on their national but also place-based support system. So their national system provides 2 years of unemployment coverage, but also paid time for training. So people can actually afford to go and retrain and think about their long-term careers. The US Workforce Opportunity for Rural Communities initiatives, for instance, wasn't just focused on just training, but there were wraparound assistance, childcare, transportation, counseling, so that the lower income, the rural, the racialized workers can participate. So if you wish, Alex, these are all design choices that go beyond just offering a training or a course. We need to think that when those sort of disruptions occur, they do not just impact the affected workers and the affected employers, but also they ripple through the entire community. There are supply chains, but there are also the local organizations and the entire community, if you wish.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that, Shaima. And I think it's we certainly all of the many hundreds of projects that we've invested in over the years since we've been a Center for Future Skills has certainly showed us the importance of those wraparound supports, those different social supports, and ensuring the success of any kind of skills or workforce development program. I wonder if I could just maybe very, very quickly from Jim or Jennifer or Abigail, just any thoughts about whether how those kinds of supports came into play in some of the other case studies that you might have looked at. Just a very quick follow-up on that, just to get a rounder picture of how important this might be in some of the other jurisdictions it looked at.
I can mention the Australian situation, Alex, where this federal authority, the Net Zero Economy Authority, did cooperate with the state level vocational training streams. They have a thing there called TAFE, which is like a vocational college. Yep. And they were working, or they are working hand in hand with the authority and also with the companies in any region where a transition event is occurring to identify what the skills requirements are going to be, including for people moving over from one of the closing coal places. So the integration between skills training and the industrial policy initiatives to create those jobs in the first place is quite close. And the cooperation between the federal and state levels is also quite positive. So I think Canada could learn on both those counts.
Yeah, it sounds like it, yeah. Jennifer, you want to anything else to add on this?
Yeah, I think actually Michigan is probably like further behind on that specific issue of being able to identify, like getting down to the level of skills identification. I mean, really their model is sort of, use a lot of the existing, workforce development or workforce transition programs that they've had for a long time and that would be very familiar and very translatable to a Canadian context, but instead to have, a coordinating function through that worker transition office to be able to better target and direct those where they're going to be needed for impacted communities. So look, I think that's something, a lot of jurisdictions are probably, it's probably a gap for a lot of us and something that is worth thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got some questions coming in on our chat here, so I'm going to start folding some of these in with the time that we've got. We do have about 20 minutes or so left for this part of the discussion for the Q&A. We've got Andrew Leal Gonzalez is asking, how do you deal with urgent issues that need to be resolved instantly, but we need to have consensus from stakeholders because getting consensus sometimes delays decisions and implementations. So again, this is something that we're all very much seized with. The speed of change seems to be accelerating. It's more volatile, seems to be more unpredictable, whether you're talking about tariffs or or even the green transition or switching to the transition to workplaces where you're using artificial intelligence, that kind of thing. And certainly it can take a while to develop these relationships. So any thoughts about how you balance the need to have those actors working together and the need to work fast?
I'm happy to take a crack at that one, Alex, because in our broader IRPP research, we've actually looked at some methods into actually identifying the susceptibility of some of those communities to such disruptions. So perhaps part of being proactive is identifying in advance those communities that are susceptible to XYZ sort of disruption. That's as a start. But also, there are policies that could be adopted for long-term plans and long-term planning, such as the agreements, for instance, that I had mentioned from the Staines case study. But also, there could be policies that are adapted for the sort of rapid response. And so they kind of pre-position the package that would be adapted or applied in a case of a disruption of a particular community. And that means initiating those discussions and those agreements and partnerships between the different stakeholders and rights holders in advance. So not waiting really till when the shock happens.
Right. Yeah. Sure. Having the infrastructure in place. I don't know, Jennifer, anything else on that? It does sound a little bit about what you were talking about with in the Michigan example, but maybe from in other case studies that you worked on as well.
Yeah, I think that issue that just a quick follow-up and to reemphasize a lot of what Shayma was just saying there about the importance of pre-identifying where are the communities that are most likely to be hit, but also at the same time having services and programs that probably can only be funded and sustained at a level of scale beyond individual local communities, having them kind of pre-tooled to be able to do rapid reaction, rapid response when needed. And maybe I'll just come back to the stuff that wasn't in the case study, but that just in terms of following what the Community Worker Economic Transition Office has been doing since we down tools on the report. They've developed this. They're calling it a playbook, and I think it's kind of an interesting approach where they're saying like, let's put together the right kinds of data tools, ways of mapping what assets local communities have, planning ahead for how we respond to local closures so that you have all of that ahead of time, right? And ready to deploy. But I would also say one thing that really struck me was the fact of how much decision making over priorities is really devolved to like the local Michigan Works offices, right? So it's that
Oh yeah.
interesting combination of figuring out what is the comparative advantage of the kinds of programs, tools, services, and funding that can only be done at a less local level, but at the same time, trusting local communities, right, to be able to set their own priorities. And there's this great quote, actually, I'll just read it from The Office that communities have a vision for their future, but there needs to be better data, tools, and coordination to bring that vision to life. And I thought, okay, that's a nice way of putting it.
Alex, if I can jump in,
Go ahead.
just
Jump in.
one dimension of this is
Yeah.
I do think, in line with what Shami was saying, that we should be cautious about assuming that all these shocks are going to be exogenous, unpredictable shocks, anyways. Of course, exogenous, unpredictable shocks do occur, but many of the changes that we're talking about don't have to be that way. And the energy transition is clearly one of them. We know that we have to shift away from fossil fuels. We've committed as a country to a certain timeline to do that by. And we shouldn't just say, here's a community that's vulnerable and let's wait and see what happens and we'll be ready to jump in.
Yeah.
We should actually be planning that transition so that people have notice, because the notice and certainty about when the transition is going to occur, because that is so important for their decisions individually to invest in things like a new qualification or to think about moving to another community, et cetera, et cetera. So we do have to be flexible and nimble, but I also think we have to recognize our capacity, if we choose to actually plan for these things rather than being victims of circumstance.
Sure. And that involves doing a lot of work right now on some of the systems that we would need to have in place, such as, we developing labor market information capacity. We've got good capacity in place already, but developing that further, looking at other models potentially for working with colleges and universities at the local level to address problems and have that sort of standing reserve capacity in place when it's needed. I think that's great, Jim. Thank you. I think we've got. Let me see if we've got any questions here. I got one. There is one question I do want to get to. Make sure we have enough time for. We've got about 10 or 12 minutes left. And I was going to ask. Several questions coming up here. Yeah, let me just see here. I had one here. It's disappeared. Some of these questions are appearing and disappearing. Okay, I've got I've got one here uh, that's good. Someone is asking whether through your research, how did you see employer demand forecasts being generated and validated at the local level? Are they tied to firm commitments like MOUs and hiring targets? I think the sense is, having delved into these case studies, that it really does vary from one to the other. But I think that's a good question. Is always a good question here when we're dealing with workforce skills development. What's the employer's role? How involved are they? How invested are they? And that kind of thing. We could go on for hours about it, but maybe I can ask some of you to go on for a couple of minutes about it at least.
Well, maybe I'll talk about this more in the sense of like that just was not it seemed necessarily part of what was happening yet in Michigan, right? But look, just in the Canadian context, I will say this as a regular user of StatCan data, that we have a real challenge in terms of getting accurate small area information, right? That in terms of our labor market, like even just tracking what's going on employment or unemployment, but also doing those labor force projections. It's really, really hard to do at a local level, unless you're talking about, for example, the Metro Toronto region. And there's an awful lot of people who live outside of it, believe it or not. So it's a real challenge. I do worry that we are sometimes stuck in the cycle here in Canada of essentially relying on, when it comes to projected demand, relying on individual employer
Yes.
projections. And I get it, like you got to do something, but those are not necessarily always developed with the same methodology. And when it's often being sort of put in the storefront window as a condition to attract public funding, you sometimes have to worry about incentives involved there. So all of this to say, I think it's a real important challenge that I hope we get better at.
Jaima, did you want to add anything to that at all?
Sure. I mean, I would definitely second Jennifer's intervention here. I mean, one of the interesting case studies was in Denmark, where the employers were quite heavily involved with the local institutions and other local partners in forecasting their need. I even think that in one of our research, when we were doing the research for the case study, we've seen that they had reached the extent where even they were working with the offshore oil and gas workers to transition, but also they were in need of further workers from elsewhere. So they were even working on their immigration policies, for instance, to bring in workers from other places and seeking on how to attract talent from elsewhere to even make the community thrive further and grow further. So that's if we're talking about employers around the table, but also to second Jen's point around data. I mean, that's one of the things that we have noted as well in a lot of our broader IRPP research projects, that local granular data, but also usable data, be it for the local communities, be it for the municipalities, be it for the organizations, be it for the employers themselves, they're not usable, they're not readily accessible. So we definitely need to do a better job on that front.
Yeah, sure. And given that the pace of change seems to be accelerating, the need for more, not just granular, but more real-time data is certainly greater than ever. I'm going to move to and I'll ask you to maybe start off on this question, which might be our last one. We've only got 6 or 7 minutes here, but I want you to maybe sort of reflect on what's going on in Canada right now. In the past year, there's been a number of policy announcements, including some big changes announced in federal budget, the Major Projects Office, the Building Canada Act, and the expected tabling of a Sustainable Jobs Action Plan, just to name a few significant sort of policy initiatives. Given the current policy landscape, if you were going to ask government for some concrete policy changes tomorrow based on the findings specifically from the case studies that you looked at, what would each of you recommend? Not everybody at once.
Well, I'll jump in from the Australian experience, which was focused on the issue of decarbonization and the adjustments and transitions that are required in it. And again, I would say that what Canada could learn from that experience is the importance of, first of all, setting a timetable for when this is going to happen. So the coal-fired plants in Australia that are closing, that will be addressed through this program, all have got decommissioning dates staged several years into the future. It's similar in a way to how Ontario phased out its coal-fired electricity plants with a firm and clear timetable that stretched over, I think, 7 or 8 years in total. And that way, people, again, know that it's going to happen. The timeline is firm, and they can prepare individually, but also the supporting mechanisms can be activated in order to help people either retire. Much of the heavy lifting in this transition is going to be done by people just retiring, especially when you've got the phased closure dates. Or if need be, look at moving into one of these other jobs that's being created. And I think the big failure in Canadian transition planning, for the most part, that Ontario Hydro case being the one exception, is just an inability or an unwillingness to actually set timelines. So we have a Sustainable Jobs Act, and we've got all kinds of consultation and jargon and commitment to fairness, and no idea of what is going to happen and when, because for various reasons, including our federal debates and the pressure from the fossil fuel sector, we have been very loath to actually set timelines for when a transition is going to occur. So that makes transition planning a bit ethereal. So I would say that that experience from Australia, limited only to one small slice of it, those coal-fired electricity plants, is very insightful in terms of the necessity of having a timeline that people can count on.
Thanks, Jim. That is interesting. Well, having the timeline is also a way of having predictability for the different actors that are involved in the decision making as well. So I think that's clearly a very important measure to take. I think you have done a bit of research on. I have seen your research looking at what it would take to transition workers off of away from fossil fuel intensive industries, and how many of those could actually be solved just by planning on attrition from retirement rather than more dramatic measures. So I encourage people to go look for some of Jim's writing on that topic as well. Jennifer or Shaima, do you want to? What's your one big recommendation for on concrete policy changes for tomorrow, given everything that's going on?
Yeah, so much going on.
Mhm.
So I guess I'm going to focus on that, that major projects office and the major
Please.
projects list.
Yep.
And look, there are some of those projects that have been announced that are fairly advanced, right? But there are going to be others. There already are some on there, and there are going to be more that are longer term, that are very early stages. And those ones are going to need a local workforce strategy that is going to have to look at the local training assets, options for distance training and skills development options, and also to be able to do like local outreach to prospective workers who are going to need, um, skills mapping and skills transition supports as well, right? And we're in a situation right now where, some parts of our PSE sector are, they're trying to keep the lights on. So they're not really in a position on their own right now to be thinking about how do we stand up, a local workforce transition to go hand in hand with this new major projects in our backyard. I also don't think that this is something we can necessarily trust that the project proponents themselves can handle alone. The proponents are not in the training and workforce outreach business, right? They are in other businesses, and that's if they have an HR office. So I think there's, I've jokingly talked about the need for, well, only really tongue in cheek, not total joke, but the need for a major social projects office to go hand in hand with a major projects office. And so, yeah, we need something like that, right? Otherwise, great project, but where's your workforce?
Yep, sure. Yep. And plenty of overlapping policy areas for different departments needing to coordinate as well, if you're talking about government. Shaima, the last word. We really are 2 minutes,
Sure.
less than 2 minutes here. So I'm
Yeah.
going to give you the last word on this before we turn it back to Christian.
Thanks, Alex. Well, my response would be definitely in line with what Jim and Jennifer had mentioned. And really, if I pick one tool that Canada could use, would be the Sustainable Jobs Action Plan to create that dedicated place-based stream that where we could co-finance sort of those transformation agreements with the local communities that are most susceptible to those sort of disruptions. And really, if those partnerships could combine not only the skills development component, but the social supports component, the place-based industrial component, as Jim mentioned, that would really ensure that those sort of major projects or any disruptions happening would really bring in the maximum benefits possible for a local community.
Great. Well, thank you very much for thanks Jennifer and Jim and Shaima and Abigail for sharing your those insights with us. There's so many questions up on the chat here still, but I think our colleagues at IRPP and FSC are going to be trying to work through some of those questions and get back to some of the participants about those. I have thousands of questions here. There's so much. There's such a wealth of insight and detail in this report and the underlying case study. So I wanted to thank our authors and panelists one more time, and I will turn it back over to Christian.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists, our speakers. This has been a great conversation, really. I had a few takeaway written down, but because we are out of time, I just want to remind a few of you who have already registered for our peer learning group. It will start at 2:15, so you have a little bit of a break. But please, we encourage you to join us. for those who have registered. Um, there's a and also please take a moment to complete a short survey that's going to pop up when you exit the Zoom this Zoom session. The feedback will really help us to grow and improve. Lastly, I will encourage you to follow us on our social media platform, Blue Sky, LinkedIn, and really thank again for your participation and for your engagement.
Thank you. Bye.